This afternoon, Brian Gerrish, and with me in the studio, Patrick Henningsen.
Great to be back, Brian.
Yeah, glad to have you back down in the West Country. Excellent. And of course, behind the scenes is Mike Robinson, who's going to be telling us quite a bit about what's been going on in Westminster, including this morning. But first of all, the weather. You said it's a bit windy outside.
Yeah, we're very windy, slightly colder than it is in London, I might add.
Yeah.
Just a touch.
So we've got typical Plymouth grey skies. We think the wind's southwesterly. It's a bit on the chilly side. I think it's about 9 degrees. But I understand north of the border the weather's turned pretty inclement. I think snow's been mentioned, but we haven't checked that today. But I think it's getting cold and unpleasant. I believe this is a penalty for playing around with the European Union. So blame it on Alex Salmond.
Yeah, there's also been reports of snow in Westminster as well, but we'll get to that later.
Snow in Westminster. That'll be the snow queen. Well, here we are. We're going to start off with Australia because I'd like to thank our viewers in Australia because they were pretty quick to pick us up on the fact that yesterday we'd reported about vaccines being sprayed, and an Australian viewer was kind enough to say to us, look, if you go and check the Australian government documents, you will find that they've actually now said that the vaccine will not be sprayed into the environment. So that's the good news, but it's going to be given as a drink to the volunteers willing to participate in the trial. No decision's been made on a licence application, and public comments on the risk assessment and risk management plan will be sought in late January 2012. So obviously there is some risk to this. I find it quite interesting that there is no risk to vaccines, of course, but we're going to have a risk assessment to make sure there is a risk or there isn't a risk. Complicated, isn't it?
That's January 2014, not 2012, by the way.
2014, okay. It's small print, Mike, and I've only got one set of glasses on at the moment, so there we are. Well, whatever's going on, can we trust the mainstream media? We certainly don't think you can, but we were just slightly amused by the Mail here picking up that the BBC is getting upset because well-paid BBC stars have been bashing the BBC, and this damages staff morale, and top director Mr. Cohen has been getting very upset. Interesting, we could say, well, I don't know, would you trust this man with the truth? I'm not too sure about that. But the BBC clearly not worried about Jimmy Savile, or the fact that they haven't had a full investigation into paedophiles in the organisation. But please stop bashing us about a variety of other matters because it damages our staff morale.
It'd be a shame, yes.
Yeah? Are these people in the real world? Well, of course they are, but they're pretty dangerous. Now, we'd like to give a mention to this. This is a tragic case from every angle. So the Independent here giving an article to say that the Royal Marine convicted of murdering the Afghan insurgent has now been named as Sergeant Alexander Blackman. We say, well, a variety of very unpleasant things take place on battlefields. The loss of the insurgent, tragic, and we don't back away from that at all. But of course the reality of war is that it's pretty vicious and unpleasant, and our politicians rely on the fact, of course, that they don't get near it. So we just like to flag up here that of course we've got this sergeant who's been out there putting his life at risk doing the job. He's named by judiciary. But of course, Tony Blair, who many consider as being protected from murder charges, well, who's protecting Tony Blair? The judiciary. Let's just look at this man. We'll just bring his photo in there. Well, if we can't trust the BBC, would we trust Tony Blair? Looking at the two images on screen at the moment, I think I know who's the man that gets my support. But we'll leave people to make up their own minds on that one. Well, is the royal family looking after Britain? Personally, I don't think so. I found it very interesting that Prince Charles, here in one of his many uniforms, I don't know how many different uniforms he's got in his wardrobe, but probably quite a few, is making a secret donation to the Philippines Typhoon Fund. So at the moment, I haven't seen anything about the royal family donating to help people in this country that can't feed themselves or haven't got jobs. And I find a slight irony in this that you make a secret donation public to get the full kudos that you've given a secret donation. So I'd like to say I'm pretty cynical about what His Royal Highness has been up to. It's nearly as bad as King David, but I'll leave Mike to deal with him. And if we talk about encroaching dictatorships and the simple lies of the Tory party, I think we're allowed to focus on Theresa May, because she says she's going to challenge the EU over the free movement of people within the European Union. Of course, this is an utter lie, because she has no power over the free movement of people within the European Union. She has, with her colleagues, treasonously given away our ability to govern ourselves. And so I think this is just a smokescreen. What do you think, Pat?
Well, the rotating post of Home Secretary, it's become very much a political position more than anything. And that's become more and more the case from the last government to this government. So I don't know, it looks like possibly Theresa May is angling for some position here, and it's part of a bigger policy push somewhere else.
Well, is she beginning to line herself up because Cameron's days are numbered as leader? There's many people starting to talk about this now. We know from our own contacts around the Westminster area that people are beginning to say that David Cameron is really not tenable. Perhaps we could emphasise this a bit. You know, this is what the media is actually saying about this man. So we've got David Cameron. He's hopped away from India now. He's over China. Well, I was in China. So children are going to learn Mandarin. They can't cope with reading and writing in English. They can't cope with skills training. But now we're going to give them Mandarin. Change of tack, he was on curries recently. But now we're going to switch over to Mandarin. So we just put the headline here. He's pledged his support for curries, Israel, China, India, curries. And now we've got Mandarin in school. So presumably it'll be takeaways. Are we surprised this country's in a mess? I mean, you don't have to make it up, do you? It's in your face.
Well, a lot of times when you have a lame duck leader of a party, be it a president or a prime minister, the world tour is very important in the sort of for the final days of their tenure, because of course they have a career after that position. Like Tony Blair, for instance, has positioned himself before he left office to be an international figure, and of course he's done quite well out of that financially as a second career.
Well, I think I'd fully support David Cameron being given a job as a curry chef, or possibly takeaway delivery boy would be appropriate after his tour.
Or teaching Mandarin in schools.
Teaching Mandarin. Mike, take us into the reality of the pantomime of Parliament.
Well, it really was a pantomime this morning. So Bullingdon Bilderberger Osborne gave his autumn statement, which was 99% something that rhymes with Bullingdon. It really was rubbish. He announced, of course, the infrastructure plan that we mentioned yesterday, and this was the graph that we showed. And as we pointed out yesterday, that infrastructure plan is £345 billion over 10 years, a paltry 34 billion a year on average. And just to put that into perspective, that's equivalent. The Chinese equivalent. That China is spending 450 billion per year, as opposed to 345 over 10 years. Okay, so that's just to put that in a bit of perspective. And if we just look at some of the other countries that are spending money on infrastructure, this is as a percentage of GDP. So China spends 8.5% of its GDP on infrastructure projects. Russia 7.3%. South Korea and Japan both on about 5%. India 4.7%, and Britain 2.9. It's pretty pathetic. And if you want to understand why we can't pay our bills, why we continue to have huge debt problems, it's because we are continuing to live in this fantasy financial world rather than the real physical economy. And of course, the other point is that those very same countries, China, Russia, South Korea, India, and Japan, these are the countries that are actively outward looking, that are actively involved with serious space programs. And of course, the technology that's developed in space programs does filter down into other real economic applications. And of course, and these are the 5 countries that are currently running missions to the moon. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they are therefore the countries that are spending the most on their basic economic infrastructure, because this is their outlook on life. So is it any surprise, by the way, that Ukraine is absolutely refusing, the Ukrainian government is refusing to get involved with the EU, which is still, focused on this bankrupt financial system, utterly bankrupt, whenever countries to the east are actually going to be the real economic superpowers for the next 50 or 100 years. That's why Ukraine's looking to them rather than the EU for their future. But anyway, that's another story. Going back to the autumn statement, as we pointed out yesterday, the largest aspect of government spending is pensions. And of course, pensions are unfunded. That means that in order to meet our annual pension obligations, we have to raise money through taxes. There's currently, as we've said many times, a £4.5 trillion black hole in that unfunded state pension scheme. And so, unsurprisingly, Osborne has announced that the pension age is rising to 68. So anybody of my age, mid-40s or so or below, will not be able to retire until they're 68. Anybody in the, say, mid-30s and below isn't going to be able to retire till they're 69. But in fact, this is an incremental change. This country cannot afford the £4.5 trillion black hole that exists in the state pension scheme. And therefore, as I've been saying for many years now, anybody of my age and younger is not going to get a state pension. We must come to this understanding unless something changes with the way that we are handling our economy and the way that we're handling the debt levels that we're carrying. So no one is going to get a pension, and that's something that has to be recognised. Pat?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. So essentially the government's saying that you're going to have to work till you're 70 years old before you can claim the state pension. But looking at the economy right now, and this is what George Osborne will not talk about, or any of them for that matter, is that so if you're expected to work till you're 70, where are the jobs going to be?
Because we're going to have more people in the market.
Yeah, from today and project forward 20 years. Where are the jobs? There are no jobs. So it's still going to cost the state either way, because you'll be on the dole. You'll be taking housing benefit and income support. So before you draw your state pension. So it's coming out of government coffers either way, because this government has not addressed the fundamental issue, which is that we're in a zero economic growth situation. They're not saying that. We have to get used to that, because what they've done is strip out the economy, offshore the jobs, offshore manufacturing. There is no growth. There are no jobs. It's still going to cost money, whether they push it back to 75 and hope that you'll die before you take your state pension.
And on top of this, we've got the movement of people seeking jobs within Europe. So this is one of the key things. Of course, the government has got to lie about the movement of people seeking jobs, because this would really be the final straw on top of what you're talking about. But perhaps the plan is to get rid of old people.
Well, clearly. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I think we've seen plenty of evidence of that in the NHS already, haven't we?
Yeah. And I think quite a few people out there are beginning to pick up on the idea that old people are simply not wanted in the country. I think they come under the useless eater title. And if you can't work for the state doesn't want you. Smiling fascism was how we described it yesterday, which probably would bring us on quite nicely to Mr. Ed Balls and the Bilderbergers, Mike.
Well, we've still got to go through this. The other sort of main aspect of the autumn statement was Osborne's comment that corporation tax would not be raised, which is what Bilderberger Balls was asking for. because Britain's corporation tax regime, according to Osborne, is, quote, the most competitive in the world. Now, corporation tax in this country is 20%, which is far from being the lowest level in the world. Ireland's is lower, for example. So, what could Osborne mean? Well, of course, he's referring to the fact that there's so many loopholes in the UK's corporation tax regime that most large corporations who can afford the tax-dodging accountancy firms can avoid corporation tax altogether. That's what he means by the most competitive corporation tax regime in the world. So, we can't afford pensions in this country. We can't afford a health service. We can't afford anybody to be alive over the age of 70. But that's okay. We're going to let these huge global corporations come here, do their business, and pay the country nothing. So that's fair enough, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know whether it's my imagination, Mike, but I just noticed that these gentlemen are all wearing fairly bland coloured ties. There's no patterns. Is there a bit of signalling going on to the other side, or is that just my imagination?
Not really sure, but I did notice that all the Labour Party people were wearing purple ties, so I'm not really sure. The multicoloured ties on one side and the purple on the other, so there you go.
I think purple has to do with the colour of the resurrection. So maybe it's
the colour of the colour of kings, I think, isn't it? The purple.
Yeah, but this is common purpose purple, in my opinion. But anyway,
is Ed Miliband seems to be suffering a bit there?
I think he's either only just awake or actually he's in some kind of trance. But anyway, Balls got up and really just did talk a load of it. And he had nothing of interest to say whatsoever. The rest of Osborne's statements, by the way, no point even covering it because it was all hot air as well. But I mean, the main comment to make about this whole escapade was that the behaviour of MPs, yet again, during this speech and during Ball's rebuttal of the speech, the MPs' behaviour was absolutely appalling. Once again, it really is an absolute circus in the House of Commons, and what can you say about it? This is not a bunch of professionals; it's a bunch of clowns.
Yeah, and of course the audio which we were unfortunately listening to in the office this morning was just people shouting I can't even describe them as children because it's an insult to children, but we've clearly got people who are not mature enough to be making any decisions about the country at all. And why is it we put up... I mean, what's an American view of watching life in Westminster?
It might have something to do with the fact that they have subsidized alcoholic drinks in the Sport and Social Club inside the Commons. So maybe they pop in for a few.
and cocaine, because we now know that cocaine's being sniffed, snorted, whatever, in Westminster.
So, I don't know. Maybe it's a liquid lunch, and I don't know. But, yeah, it's like a bad school assembly.
Yeah. Probably is what goes on inside Eton. So they're programmed with how it's run in the school debating society, and they bring it into Westminster. But we want to clean the country up. It's quite clear that our politicians have got to be replaced with some decent and moral people. But take us to the love triangle.
Yes. Well, it's been a lot of talk in the news, especially in the American press, regarding the deal that has been signed in Geneva with Iran with regards to Iran's nuclear deal, that the U.S. has stabbed Israel in the back. This is what the conservative Republicans are saying. And that they've stabbed Israel in the back, and Saudi Arabia is upset. So one of the really, really clever academic Lebanese author, Amal Saad Ghorayeb, has basically said that if you analyze the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Israel in terms of the psychiatric international psychiatric medical disorder manual, that Saudi Arabia is having borderline personality disorders, which is expressing itself in abandonment issues.
Right.
So this is sort of like a girlfriend or a spouse who is upset because they're afraid their partner is going to leave them for someone else. Right. So it's broken down absolutely brilliantly, and so the U.S. has narcissistic. More than tendencies, right. A full-blown narcissistic personality profile, as does Britain and France, by the way. But in the U.S., it's especially strong. So Saudi Arabia is saying, I hate you, but don't leave me. So really, if you look at this in terms of a relationship, U.S. married Saudi Arabia for the money early on. They run their whole, through Saudi Aramco, the whole oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia is really run by American and British staff. Right. So if they will never pull out, because if they do, the Saudi Arabia wouldn't know what to do. They wouldn't be able to run the oil industry in their country. So that's not going to happen. But in Israel, meanwhile, the U.S. is in bed with Israel. And Israel is more of the spicy partner in the relationship, and also the one that's threatening to blackmail, the
so
breadwinner.
We're joking, but we're not joking. We've got a destructive relationship going on here between, with foreign policy between these countries.
Full-blown borderline personality disorders. And to make matters worse, the U.S. is now flirting with Iran. And really, if you want to look at this in terms of, there's a lot of manipulation going on, obviously. Saudi Arabia cannot do anything, but Israel obviously can do a lot of manipulation in U.S. politics because the lobby is absolutely strong from a financial point of view, and also with links in media and politics that can put a lot of pressure with all things Israel.
Well, and in this country, we've got conservative friends of Israel boasting that they've got influence with over 80% of the Tory MPs, which is pretty extraordinary.
So Israel has a histrionic personality disorder from a psychiatric point of view. So they tend to a combination of manipulation and seduction, and also playing the victim, and is constantly in need of rescuing. But really, the bottom line here is the U.S. is now taking a slight change of tact, whereby they want to. Saudi Arabia has gotten a little bit out of control, especially with regards to Syria and how they've been financing and backing the insurgency and the Islamic insurgency. So by the U.S. reaching out across to Iran to shore up some kind of relationship there, it's really saying, the U.S. is saying, we're in control of the destiny of this region and not Saudi Arabia, no matter how much money you throw at it. And likewise to Israel as well. So is this shift going on? Is this a planned shift? It's hard to tell right now, but it's definitely very different than it was 6 months ago.
Yeah. Well, we've certainly found a lot of what's happening in the area complex. You try and analyse what's going on, but that's a brilliant description that we've got personality disturbances in nations, but of course we should also add to that the main players negotiating, William Hague, for example, is this a man that we would be relying on for stability and sound decisions? Probably not. Tony Blair is cruising around in the background. Monster ego there. Goodness knows what else the problems are.
Sure, and John Kerry on the other side.
Yeah.
And Barack Obama. Barack Obama is probably the epitome of the narcissist as a politician. As is Tony Blair.
Yeah.
So those two have a lot alike. So yes, these are people representing our countries, gallivanting
who
around.
are disturbed themselves.
Well, according to the International Journal of Psychiatric Evaluations, yes, they are. So.
Okay. Well, take us into Syria, because this is becoming really complex at the moment.
This is becoming complex, but this is very interesting. Okay, what do we have here? This is now the General Idris, who is the leader of the Free Syrian Army, has now announced, and they're due to go to Geneva in January. The opposition and the Syrian government are due to have talks in January in Geneva, and this is where it's going. General Idris has said that he's talking about, hold on to your seat, a new coalition between the armed opposition, the FSA, Free Syrian Army, and the Assad government to root out the Islamic insurgency in Syria. I mean, and so essentially this is the direction it's going, Brian. So what does this say? I'll say that this is exactly what that we identified the Islamic insurgency, the Al-Qaeda elements, as the main threat in this conflict back in August and September. And just now, so you can see this is where the talking points have gone. So we were right back then.
Right. And can I add on top of that, of course, we're saying that Al-Qaeda is a Western-backed force, in fact?
Yes, and so
Yeah.
the people who were who were opposition really played down this involvement of Al Qaeda and the Islamic insurgents early on, before the vote in Westminster specifically, and for the whole year and 2 years before, because they turned a blind eye to it, as did our governments.
Well, Conservative MP Brooks Newmark, of course, was one of the classic men. He was busy talking about his meetings with General Idris, but at the same time saying, well, links with Al-Qaeda, but don't worry about those.
Yeah, they all played it down. They turned a blind eye to it because they thought it was going to suit their goal, which was to, A, was regime change in Syria, and B, via U.S. and British military intervention. So as that agenda failed, now all of a sudden the Islamic insurgency, which is being funded by the Saudis and by the Qataris and others, is a problem.
Yeah.
We're told now. So we were right, they were wrong back then. But now at least I see this as progress, Brian, because that to me is the thing when I speak to people in Damascus, which I just have done recently, and this is their big worry. The big worry is the Islamic insurgency, which have links to, the CIA and other intelligence agencies. That's pretty well documented throughout history. We'll put that aside for a minute, but that is the major threat. That's what Syrians are worried about. They're worried about the Islamic insurgency more than they are about the Assad government, even opponents of the government. Well, so it's about stability at the end of the day.
You've mentioned the man, so we'll bring him up on screen. This was, I think, from yesterday or possibly a couple of days ago, and I was fascinated with this article because the big headline was Syria crisis, massive evidence implicates Assad in war crimes, says UN. But when you got into the article, it absolutely didn't say that. In fact, the final sentence was actually saying the whole thing was now very complex, very blurred, and it wasn't even saying evidence, it was saying what they had needed to be, sorry, there's an L missing from fully, we're going to lose 1,000 viewers as a result of a spelling mistake, but basically they're saying the thing needed to be fully investigated in order to present the evidence. So here's British mainstream headline, just going straight the way for Assad, but you read the detail of the article and actually the story goes in a different direction. Now, we're going to say that in recent weeks we've been contacted by Syrians who are very concerned about what's going on in their country, and what they're saying to us is that if we focus on victims, civilians are dying in their tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. These deaths are continuing, but we're not getting truth out about what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that is a good point. And you have to sympathize with both sides of this conflict. Okay, mm-hmm. It's not a one-sided conversation. The government and state-run police and army there have been responsible for civilian casualties in Syria, without a doubt. And of course, you can argue over the numbers. So it really it comes down to a numbers game with both sides, because at the end of the day, Brian, the death toll numbers are the key component in the campaign for regime change in Syria. It's all about numbers in the media and also with the UN and so forth. So that is the provenance. So you have to ask, what are the motivations behind different parties presenting certain numbers?
Yep.
And you also have to look at the context of it, which is that this is, for lack of a better modern term, a civil war. And throughout history, in these types of wars, be they civil or World War II or anything, when armies situate themselves and rebels situate themselves in urban areas, in cities, in city centers and towns, there are going to be civilian casualties. Mm. It is war, and it's ugly, and so I'm not going to say that that side is not wanting for reform, that their motivations are not, and their intentions are not for the best for the Syrian people, because they probably are. But the problem is, we are sitting here in Britain, Brian, or if we were sitting in America, the problem is the political agenda from our governments with regards to intervention, reconstruction, and and obviously we know how the country will be carved up economically if there is a regime change.
Yeah.
So,
well, what I'm going to suggest on the spot is that we just run through a few more articles from the papers on this subject, and we'll also delve into some of the statistics on the death, and then perhaps we can come back to a little bit of discussion about what we think is really going on there, and who the key players are. So I've got another independent one. I thought this was quite interesting. Exclusive: foreign doctors raise alarm over Syrian birth defects. Now, the moment I saw that, this brings home what has now been widely publicised in about Iraq, that due to the use principally of depleted uranium weapons, massive rise in birth defects. And if anybody wants to go and look at some of the film and images on the internet, you better brace yourself, because the images of deformed children are truly shocking. So we've seen Tony Blair and Western allies get in and rip up Iraq, and now here we are, not surprisingly, I think, with birth defects now starting to be flagged up in Syria, and of course the same weapon supplies will have been present both in Iraq and Syria, so this shouldn't surprise us. Then we get on to the propaganda starts, and I'm going to say I'm pretty disappointed that Downton Abbey beauty Michelle Dockery should start to get in amongst this stuff. I think she'd be better off staying at Downton Abbey. But now we've got the media people. This is the good emotive stuff, so she's going into the camps. We got Oxfam. Well, does Oxfam help, or does Oxfam make its money out of misery? It depends whether it's cup half full or a cup half empty. But this is the propaganda starting in the British press. We're not seeing any move by the government, but we have got, I want to call her a pop star, but of course she's an actress. And this is quite interesting. This graph here of daily deaths, so running from the 16th of November this year up until the 3rd of December. This has been compiled from information sent to us by one of our Syrian sources. And what have we got? Well, we've always got at least 50 people dying a day. Now, these are purely civilian deaths. They don't relate to casualties amongst the Free Syrian Army or Freedom Rebel fighters, or indeed the government forces. These are innocent men, women and children who are dying as a result of the war, and some of them, we haven't broken it down further, but with the information we've got, there are always a number of people who are designated as dying as a result of torture. So this is an indication of the tragedy going on in Syria at the moment. Just to show you a little more how things can be broken down, we get some information on where these deaths took place. So we've got Damascus and suburbs, 974, etc. And is it talking about torture? On this one it isn't, but on, oh yes, one martyr under torture. So however these figures are being compiled, they are actually bringing up where people are being tortured to death. Now I've just put this one in to show the type of material that's circulating at the moment, but this is a flyer that's been sent through to us, and information can come through this sort of source. We haven't fully checked out what this means or where it's coming from, but I'm just putting it up to say that at the moment there is quite a lot of information about Syria circulating on the internet, which is not, of course, being shown in the mainstream media. If we go in a different direction, we can go straight into work done by the United Nations. This is a report from the 2nd of January, and they're saying that between March 2011 and November 2012, we're talking about 59,648 unique killings. And they're pretty confident on these figures because of the data and evidence provided. And if I go into the report in a little more detail, They're listing here some of the sources that they were taking information for in order to get these figures. And in fact, the following paragraph to the one I've got on screen at the moment actually listed, I think it was another 3 sources. So we've got a large number of sources, but let's think of that figure, 60,000 people, many of them children, are dying. Reuters here, well, they're saying a figure of 126,000. Now that, I understand, is total to date. Most of those figures are taken from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Times World here, 115,000, more than 41,000 civilians have been killed in the 2.5-year civil war. And this is the Oxford research group that is also producing information. Sorry, where is it? Here we are. And they're starting to get in some of the details. So by the end of August 2013, 11,420 children aged 17 years and younger have been recorded killed in the Syrian conflict. And they're giving the total as 113,735.
Civilians and combatants.
That's, yes, and combatants in that one.
Yeah, depending on what source you look at, you'll see the very different totals.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw last year some totals being put out as high as 200,000 earlier this year. And very little attribution as to what is the provenance of those figures.
Yeah.
So again, it comes down to the numbers are important in terms of if you want to push a campaign or push for regime change or push for military intervention or push for more aid, whatever the case is from either side. The numbers are important in that, but how accurate are the numbers and can they be used politically? And I'm going to say yes, and they have been.
Yeah.
And also to put numbers forward, Brian, that look to be civilian casualties, but they don't tell you that that's also including combatants, and that there's a little bit of deception there in the media, which runs on a regular basis. So it's important to really have a really close look at what you're looking at here.
But we could be having this discussion about Iraq. We could be having this discussion about Libya. Even Afghanistan, what the true figures are. But what we're seeing is everywhere that we've had the British, American, Western hand touching, we're ending up with hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. Mm-hmm. And unless we actually get to the bottom of what's going on here, we are not going to be able to unpick the situation in Syria. So we've put these figures forward today to show that we are still deeply concerned about the number of people suffering as a result of the conflict in Syria. We're deeply concerned about the role of the British and I believe the American governments in ensuring that this pot is well and truly stirred. So as Patrick is just saying, victims and victim numbers can be used for a political agenda. And we're going to hope to put together something in more detail about an analysis of what's actually happening in the country and who the hidden hand is. But I think that those figures will make people think. And isn't it noticeable how the excitement of a sort of missile attack on Syria, that's gone away. So we always loved the long-range high-technology killing machine. Of course, the BBC's simply forgotten the issue now, the mainstream papers in general. Meanwhile, the Syrian people, and in particular innocent men, women and children, continue to suffer as a result of what's going on. Despicable.
Yeah, it's sad to see because the political steam came out of the whole drive to war. That all of a sudden the British Broadcasting Corporation is just not interested. It's not fun anymore. It's not sexy. It's not topical. But there is a humanitarian disaster in Syria and also in Lebanon and Jordan and some of the surrounding areas. And so it doesn't surprise me, Brian, because from the onset, the BBC and other mainstream press, including The Guardian, were not interested in looking at both sides of the story. And here now all of a sudden they're saying that, maybe it's a good idea that the opposition joins forces with the Assad government to root out al-Qaeda out of Syria.
Yeah.
How many months later?
And that is completely overlooking the fact that we know that in the early days the Assad regime was being particularly brutal when it was countering demonstrations. So what is the truth? We don't know at the moment, but we're going to continue to dig very hard. And if viewers and listeners do have the ability to talk to people connected with Syria, particularly people who are inside Syria, we're very, very interested to hear from you. I'm just going to tag on to the end of that. When we were talking earlier, Patrick said, well, isn't it amazing, of course, we look at the sort of vicious dictatorships which have been there around Middle Eastern countries. And here we are in UK in 2013, and we are seeing this slow but creeping surveillance society coming into place. And I know that you've picked up here on the Snowden leak and NASA tracking us.
Yes. So this is one of the latest, and this is one of many that we're said to receive as an early Christmas present, Brian, from the Ed Snowden cache. So cell phone tracking locations on an unprecedented scale. So we're talking about logs, millions and millions of phone logs.
Billions. I think this
billions.
Article from the Mail here is saying 5 billion cell phones every day.
Sure.
And so I'm just going to interject here. This is 5 billion. Well, we're talking about a system which is so massive. It could be double this. The capabilities there. If you've got a phone, you're going to be tracked.
Yeah, down to 100 meters of your location.
Or less.
Yeah, but so this is using GPS tracking, and obviously this is probably, I don't know if this is easier.
Yeah.
Mike, you might be able to correct me on this, but with 3G and 4G technology, smartphone technology, making their job a lot easier in terms of pinpointing and tracking your locations. Mike?
Yeah, look, I have a it's freely available on the internet, but I have a presentation, an internal NSA presentation that came to light as a result of the Snowden leaks, really singling out Apple location services as being the best thing that ever happened to the NSA, and really, and the comment that really got me, one of the slides basically said, I can't remember the exact words, but it was along the lines of, and the suckers are even paying for the privilege, right? But you know, as I said on your program a week or so ago, Patrick. If we look back at what John Poindexter was set up to do through the DARPA Information Awareness Office program, most of Snowden's leaks are related to programs that began under that Poindexter program. And they told us in 2001, 2002, when that was being established, they told us what their intention was and what they intended to do. And here we are 10 years later, 11 years later, talking about it. It's now being leaked, and most of the media coverage on this is on how it's something, a real surprise to people that it's happened. It should not be a surprise to us that it's happened. They told us they were going to do it. So,
yeah, and the Echelon program from the late 80s, early 90s, which was also a little legal loophole. The United States put its Cold War days, or the end of the Cold War, but to put its massive spying and data collection, phone call listening operation in Britain, because they couldn't do it in the United States, and vice versa. The British listening outfit GCHQ allowing the NSA to do work maybe in Europe that might be of a slightly dubious legal standing here.
So I can't believe you're suggesting that the security forces might do something dubious.
Well, they do that on a regular basis. So they get each other to do jobs that they can't do themselves in their own country for legal reasons. So this is another big fundamental problem with this. And that's the political conversation that we would like to see brought up to the surface. The leaks,
a proper debate about it.
Yes.
And also, I'm going to say we're becoming increasingly suspicious with where the Guardian is in this wonderful story over Snowden, because the Guardian seems to be rather tighter to the government than many people would believe. And we're also particularly interested in what goes on behind the scenes at the Guardian with their linkage into David Cameron's big society, which of course is communitarianism. But we can perhaps reinforce the spying aspect, because if NSA picking up phones is what we'll call hard spying or hard surveillance, this is, well, give it to them on a plate. So Yahoo here talking about firms being able to exploit smartphones in order to purchase, buy, give data, marketing, sales, advertising. So if you've got one of these phones, be aware of what you're actually doing. On the other hand, I don't get too paranoid about it, because clearly I'm not doing anything wrong. We're just sort of pointing out that the government requires replacing with a better sort of people. But if you want to know how to deal with this sort of stuff, well, be adventurous. Give your phone or swap phones with a trusted friend for a few weeks. Have some interesting conversations, because if we had 50 million people actually saying the right things on a hour-by-hour basis, life would be very difficult for the surveillance systems. Mm-hmm. Well, we're getting towards the close here. We get very interesting emails from people. I decided to pick up on this one. Somebody sent in and said that they wanted to speak to their local passport office, a general inquiry. It wasn't person specific, but it was a general inquiry of the passport office. But the person on the other end demanded to know details. They wanted to know names and addresses, and they said they couldn't actually answer any questions unless they had the information. So the person who sent this in to us made some really good comment, and also pointed out that when you talk to the passport office through the internet, this is the connection into surveillance, you come up against a company called Teleperformance. So we thought we'd go and have a little look into them. Here's the passports office. Now, the first thing we get to is, of course, it's going to cost you a mere £1.53 per minute even to talk to them. So well done, David Cameron. Curries are important, but if we can charge £1.53 per minute for a phone call to the passport office, we're fleecing the British public pretty quickly. We get into the Tele company. Well, what are they interested in? They're interested in the Global Compact. They're interested in strategic policy from the United Nations to align businesses with human rights, labour, environment, and anti-corruption. Wow. So this is a company we should all be supporting, because they believe in UN policy. They're working to help create the one world socialist state. Trust us, we're not involved in corruption. Well, £1.53 a minute sounds dodgy to me. Yeah. It's in your face when you know where to look at it. Money, the root of all evil.
Well, this is really interesting. If you've been following Bitcoin recently, and you should be, Bitcoin just recently broke the $1,000 mark, so $1,000 for Bitcoin. Now, this is going to basically increase Bitcoin's value, in my opinion. Ron Paul, who's an icon of free market principles, Austrian School of Economics, a libertarian. So he's come out and said that Bitcoin could destroy the dollar, and that's a mainstream report via CNN Money. And Ron Paul points out that, by using Bitcoin, this is the virtual cryptocurrency. It's an electronic currency. It's mined. It's decentralized. So you don't have to deal with banks. There's no fees. It's clearly inflation-proof, well, at least so far in its lifespan. But the money supply is limited. That's the important part. And also, you can retain your privacy by trading with Bitcoin. So it's really interesting that the Ron Paul's finally come out in Bitcoin. That's only going to increase Bitcoin awareness for people who aren't already interested or looking into it. But it's important that people understand that when we talk about Bitcoin, it's really become a commodity. Not so much, it's not recognized as an official currency, but it is a commodity. It can be traded for goods and services, and it's experiencing deflation right now. So obviously there are people who've made a lot of money off Bitcoin who got into Bitcoin early, and it's increased in value over the years. But looking beyond that, Bitcoin just got this incredible deflationary quality to it. And part of this has been driven by the Chinese, which we might talk about in a minute.
Mike, what would we say our line is on Bitcoin?
I don't think we have a line. I mean, I'm waiting to see. I think there's a lot of speculative activity going on around Bitcoin at the moment. I think that worries me a bit because it has the potential to be a pretty big bubble, and people could get seriously stung by it in the not too distant future. I don't see, there are some companies willing to accept Bitcoin as a mechanism of exchange, as money, but that's still a relatively small number of companies. For example, when you consider that Bitcoin is probably most attractive to people that are fairly aware of what the privacy implications of using the internet are. I'm only aware of one virtual private network supplier, for example. This is the type of organization you might want to go to if you want to surf the web anonymously. There's only one that I'm aware of that'll accept Bitcoin as a payment for that service. So it's still pretty young in terms of being able to use it as a money supply. But on the other hand, there's lots of speculation going on around it at the moment. And the other thing to be nervous about, perhaps, is that, of course, if you were a government and wanted to destroy Bitcoin, then what you might do is do what's exactly happening, push the price of Bitcoins up to the point where it becomes an unsustainable level, and eventually people that a large number of people start getting involved in it. When the price goes up, then you pull the rug out again and people get stung, just as happened with the .com bubble and many other bubbles, for example. Yeah. And of course, this is stealing money from people who get into the game later. The people that have had Bitcoins for half a dozen years or so now are absolutely making a killing, and there are many Bitcoin millionaires as a result of the fact that they got in right at the very beginning. Right. So, one of the other advantages that we've highlighted a number of stories on this program over the last several months where people have been trying to smuggle gold coins onto airplanes and whatnot through airports. Of course, with Bitcoin, you only need a USB stick, and the people in security can only see a USB stick, and they can't see what's on the USB stick. So if you want to move money from one country to another, it's a good way to do it. There's no question that there will be a small proportion of people will be using it for money laundering purposes, and of course that'll be one of the excuses made for trying to regulate it and attack it. But use it while it's there I think is a good piece of advice. But if you think it's going to, if you're going to buy into it in order to make a fast buck, you're probably going to get your fingers burnt in the not too distant future.
Okay, so take us on to China.
Well, the next story. So, the Chinese authorities, the People's Bank, have issued a warning telling people to avoid Bitcoin. Now, one of the things that's really driven up the value and activity with Bitcoin has been obviously Chinese speculation. So that apparently the Chinese cannot get enough of cryptocurrencies, whether they be Bitcoin, Litecoin, or Quarks, or any of these others. There's about a dozen of them right now. So now the Chinese are definitely heavily trading Bitcoins. There's Bitcoin exchanges that have opened up through Chinese markets. And this is really interesting because this is all coming at the same time. I mean, the total amount of Bitcoins in circulation right now, we're talking about $7.2 billion worth of Bitcoins in circulation at the current value. But right now, China is also making moves in the financial markets. It's just signed a memorandum of understanding between the Hong Kong and Singapore exchange markets to combine forces to market their financial products. Right. Now, this is big news with regards to China. So putting Bitcoin aside, the Chinese are driving, according to many analysts, driving the cryptocurrencies and the activity by Chinese speculators. Cannot get enough of them. As soon as they're released, they're mining them.
In parallel with that, I think the Chinese have said they're not accepting any more dollars as reserve currency at the moment, which is going to put huge pressure on the states.
Yeah, the dollar is taking a hit in many different places, including the Hong Kong stock market and Singapore as well. Yeah. So those markets are now bonding together. They used to, for instance, Hong Kong and Singapore used to be in very, very rough competition with each other for investment capital, for money. Yeah. Now they've joined forces to market financial products together. This is only bad news for dollar-denominated financial products.
But very good news for the Trilateral Commission, building the
Yes.
Pacific Asia rim.
Yeah, so if you look into the future, you can definitely look as it's pushing an arc of a trend here.
Okay, well, if we're worried about events in the world, comfort eating is clearly the solution, and you're a bit worried about that as well.
Yes, this is a really important article. This happens to be written for 21st Century Wire. This is by Andrew McKillop. Andrew McKillop, in case you're not familiar with who he is, you've probably seen his articles. He's an expert on nuclear power, nuclear weapons, nuclear radiation. He's worked in the field for many years, including an advisor to the European Commission. Now, he's basically showing your viewers and everybody exactly where nuclear waste is used. And one of the places where nuclear waste, the joys of nuclear waste, this is the first section of the article, is being used by some companies for irradiating the foods that we eat, be they vegetables, meat, or other items that we buy in the supermarket. And a lot of this is, the government regulations for the radiation of foods for years has been spinned as some kind of a positive thing, that it's good that our foods are receiving. And the doses that they're irradiating our food with are in some cases thousands of times higher than what is sort of survivable for a human to be radiated with. And of course, this is being done to our foods, but there's a lot of risk and talk about not only how this can be passed on to us through the food supply. And it's a very detailed report. I really encourage people to go look at it and then ask the question. You really need to know what you're eating. And this idea of irradiating foods and being sold is a fantastic, wonderful idea. They call it pasteurization. But even when this named after Louis Pasteur, he didn't envision this type of
where it would lead to
this type of pasteurization, which I'm going to argue has severe dangers involved. Maybe not to this generation, but this is the kind of problem that we have that's totally institutionalized and in our businesses and through our government food protection agencies and regulators agencies that could affect us next generation or the next generation. So we really need to take a hard look at it right now. And this is mainly to increase the shelf life. This is a product of globalization in terms of we're having to import all our foods. It's got to stay longer in transit, longer in storage, and it has to have a longer life. So it's a problem. So
I'm going to say that somewhere I've got a little pamphlet that I was given some time ago, but it was talking about the rise of pasteurization of milk in UK and pointing out that although we've been told that this is essential and it's very important for our health that milk is pasteurized, in fact the evidence pointed rather different direction. I'll see if I can get that pamphlet out and perhaps we might include it tomorrow. Okay, well, thank you for that, Patrick. We'll just end on the fact that tonight at 6 o'clock, Liberty Tactics, got there in the end, will be teaming up with Guerrilla Media. Is young Mike there at all? He is. If we just bring that one on screen, thank you. So we're going to be talking with Pete Santilli, and I'm happy to say, I know there's all sorts of discussion going on, but in the talks that we've had with Pete Santilli, it's obvious that this man is really looking at how the monster is being installed in American society. So we're, from the US side, he's talking about Saul Alinsky policy. He's talking about Common Core in schools, a unified thing in the education. And of course, the roots of our very own Common Purpose political charity in UK stem very much with Common Cause in America.
And the communitarian
stuff,
aspects of these programs and how this has made its way really deeply rooted in all our public institutions and even through charities as well and foundations and corporations. So yes, the issues that are facing America are some of the same issues facing Britain and Europeans.
Yeah.
and it's happening at the same time.
I'm going to say, Patrick, there are very few people who are actually getting into this detail of what's happening around us. We can talk about very high level threats of policy coming from the United Nations. Well, that is a problem, but of course, at the end of the day, it's what's happening around you at a local level, from your village hall, from your local authority. This is the bit that presents the real and present danger to us. So it's far from being an illusion. What we're actually talking about is we're talking about the reality of a creeping dictatorship. And I'm going to say that Pete seems to know his stuff on this. Okay, that's it for today. We'll be back with you same time tomorrow. Thanks very much for joining us. And thank you very much to our overseas viewers. Thank you. Bye-bye.